Thank you for tuning in. You're watching arirangtv's special coverage of COVID-19. I'm Min Sun-hee. The number of new infections is falling in Korea, but the economic costs of COVID-19 are rising. In this edition, we take a look at the efforts underway here to ease the fallout that is starting to take on an alarming shape. But first, here are the headlines for this Tuesday with our Kwon So-ah and Noaram. Welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
So I understand we have 9 new cases today, and hence the government is poised to open some public facilities starting tomorrow.
Right, and that is in line with the eased social distancing guidelines that were announced on the weekend and that are in effect since Monday. The government plans to gradually open facilities with lower risks of infections. Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun at a meeting this morning said beginning Wednesday, public facilities such as forest lodges and tree gardens are set to operate again, but in compliance with quarantine guidelines. Also mentioning how many people are waiting for sports facilities to reopen, the government has requested local districts to review their quarantine situation to prepare for a gradual reopening. And that will probably start with outdoor sports facilities such as badminton and tennis courts. But Chung asked for the nation's people to refrain from gatherings such as meals in large numbers before and after their respective sports activities. And now let's take a look at our daily updates. We have 9 new confirmed cases in the country. That brings the total to 10,683. One more person died of the coronavirus, bringing the death toll to 237. And more than 90 people have recovered from the virus, and more than 2,200 people are still in quarantine. And if you take a look at our map here, we have 2 new cases in the capital Seoul, 2 in Gyeonggi-do province, and also 2 in the city of Daegu, which now accounts for around 64% of all cases in the country. And 3 of the new cases were detected at airport checkpoints, while 5 out of the 9 new cases were overseas cases. Now, meanwhile, authorities said if cases surge again in the country, we may have to return to the stricter social distancing measures, which means although we see an obvious decline right now, it doesn't mean we can go back to our daily lives that we enjoyed before the outbreak.
Right. Meanwhile, on the global front, it looks like the spread of the virus is slowing down in some of the worst hit countries.
Yes, we're talking about Europe here because in Spain and Italy before we had daily cases in around 10,000. So it's not that extreme anymore in some countries. We will take a closer look at the numbers later. But first, the slowdown is why some countries in Europe are slowly mulling over ending their lockdowns. One of those places where we're seeing easing of restrictions has started last week in Austria, which was one of the fast responders to the pandemic. Following a lockdown on March 16th, now the country is reopening step by step, starting with small retailers last week as daily cases dropped to the double digits. By mid-May, Austria plans to allow restaurants to reopen also in the evening, as well as operate museums. The country has a little less than 15,000 confirmed cases and around 470 COVID-19 related deaths. And now onto some places that are far from easing measures. In Russia, where strict preemptive measures in the early stages of the spread seemed to be effective, such as entry bans from China very early on, daily cases now are rising at a worrisome rate, with officials saying Moscow will reach the peak of the outbreak in 2 or 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Turkey has surpassed China in total cases on Monday, with at least 2,140 deaths ever since its first official coronavirus-related death on March 17th. But it's one of the countries where official records appear to be lower than the real figures, as data suggest the city of Istanbul alone recorded a spike in overall deaths compared to recent years. And now taking a closer look at countries with major outbreaks. In the U.S., we have more than 783,000 total cases. That's more than threefold compared to other countries. And Spain, a day after the death toll passed 20,000, the total cases now stand at over 200,000. And Iran is now, along with Turkey, one of the countries that have surpassed China with total total cases, that is. And in the meantime, Turkey, Russia, and France are among countries with the highest number of new infections.
All right, so thank you for that. Aram, we're seeing a slowdown in new infections, of course, but there are still concerns over imported cases.
That's right. Authorities are not letting their guards down, and nor should they. I mean, there is a slowdown, but import cases still account for nearly half or even more than half of the new cases in Korea. Imported cases have now surpassed 1,000, which is almost 10% of Korea's total infections. There are particular concerns over secondary and tertiary infections, as there have been cases where people arriving from overseas have been violating quarantine and self-isolation rules. There are also many countries that are trying slowly to get their economies back on track, as Soa mentioned. Therefore, they might loosen movement restrictions and in turn loosen the travel restrictions to and from Korea as well, which could mean that there will be more overseas arrivals in the near future, prompting officials to stay cautious. If quarantine rules do stay in place for the increased overseas arrivals, the number of violations in turn will also increase as well, despite government efforts to contain such violations. And experts are advising the government to take preemptive measures to curb any possible spike in infections from overseas.
As I mentioned in our global updates, it's now other countries where the cases are surging, and we know that South Korea has the strongest measures on Europe and the US. So I think we should be careful about these other places where the countries where the numbers are surging, because we do have many South Korean nationals still living in those other places abroad.
That's right, and many more of them are scheduled to come back as well. Yeah.
Right. Meanwhile, I see we have yet another message of appreciation for Korea's test kits.
That's right. The US state of Maryland is one of them. It has obtained 500,000 test kits from Korea following weeks of negotiations that will significantly increase the state's testing capacity. The governor, Larry Hogan, said he and his wife, who happens to be a Korean American, made a personal plea in Korean, in fact, to South Korea's ambassador to the US in late March. He said they spoke of what he called the special relationship between Maryland and Korea. That call set in motion about 22 days of vetting and negotiations, and eventually a Korean Airlines jet flew a portion of the supplies to Baltimore-Washington International Airport over the weekend. The governor said the 500,000 test capacity is roughly equal to the total amount of testing that has been completed by 4 of the top 5 states in America combined. Hogan added that he secured the test kits because President Trump made clear that state governors were on their own. But Trump later criticized Hogan's comment about US testing capacity, saying he needed, quote, more knowledge.
Now, we've spoken about how young people are not completely safe from COVID-19, but a new study shows that newborns are at particular risk.
Yeah, so the particularly young infants are particularly at risk. A newborn baby in Korea, less than a month old, was actually tested positive late last month, along with her mother. Luckily, the baby's symptoms were not that severe, and though at one point she did have a very high temperature and problems breathing, but has since recovered from that. And both the child and mother are safe now, even if they didn't receive any medication, or much medication, that is, and the baby was able to recover, in fact, with just breastfeeding alone. So that was a positive sign there. But researchers have found, after collecting samples from the baby, that the amount of coronavirus found was 100 times more than that was found in her mother, which is an alarming figure. And the virus was also found in almost all samples collected from the baby, whereas it wasn't detected in the blood or urine samples collected from the mother. So it seems to be spreading more widespread in the baby rather than adults. And the findings obviously have raised alarm amongst medical officials, as the underdeveloped immune system of newborns could prove to be detrimental. And so medical experts are therefore urging that young infants be very closely monitored and taken care for with special care.
Right. Okay, Aram, thank you for that. So thank you. I understand you'll be staying with us until after the briefing for a summary of that. Right. Now we turn now to the regular briefing by the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters for the latest on the COVID-19 situation in Korea. Just as authorities have been emphasizing, there are concerns of a possible second wave of infections in light of the increased social contact last week as voters headed to polling places and people commemorated Easter. Now this is precisely why social distancing has been extended, albeit in an eased manner. Here now is the briefing, and we will come back to you after it.
First, here is Mr. Kwon Junuk. Let us now begin our regular briefing for April 21st, Tuesday.
총 누적 확진자 수는
The total number of confirmed cases stands at 10,683, and of them, 8,231 have been discharged following full recovery. And this also includes 1,011 imported cases from overseas, and 91.6% of them were Korean nationals. And 91 more people have been discharged, and also we have 9 new cases as of yesterday. And unfortunately, we had one more fatality. I send my deepest condolences to those who have passed away and the members of the bereaved families.
지역별 발생 현황을 보면
And let me now walk you through the regional breakdown of the confirmed cases. And we had 4 cases in the community transmission, and 2 in Seoul and 2 in Gyeonggi province.
81.0%.
And nationwide, 81.7% were related to cluster infections. And looking at the sources of infection for the past 2 weeks, 51.2% were related to the imported cases, and also infections through these imported cases amounted to 8.5%. And also we have some changes as of the cluster infections. And at the Ujeongbu St. Mary's Hospital in Gyeonggi-do Province, we had one more positive case. And in Dalsunggu of the Daegu City, at the second Miju Hospital, we have carried out a screening testing for all of the staff and patients there. And we have one more patient there. And also at the Fatima Hospital, we also carried out screening testings, and we have one more person testing positive for the virus. And the National Institute for Health, we are carrying out a research and development with the working level task force of the PAN government. And tomorrow we will have another separate meeting on the supplies that are needed at the site. And we will be mentioning on the supply and demand for the treatment, vaccine, infection control equipment. And we will also have our ears open to any challenges that are faced on site. And the KCDC, we have announced a new form of social distancing campaign, which has been slightly relaxed until May 5th. So we believe that at facilities that have a higher risk of infection, we ask them to be on continued closure. And if these have to be operated, we would like to advise you that you need to have body screening, temperatures checked for the users, and we need to also have regular ventilation and display of disinfectants at these sites. And in order to curb the further outbreak of the virus, it is very important to reduce people-to-people contact and abide by the personal hygiene measures. We also highlight this once again, but when you go to cluster places, crowded places, which are closed door, keep a 2-meter distance with each other. Please wear face masks and wash your hands. And please never forget to disinfect your own hands. And relating to the briefing today, we have a special message to the public. And as the quarantine authorities, we currently believe that this every moment that we are going through right now is an important time, and we believe it's the best time for us to transition ourselves to the everyday life quarantine measures. Recently, we are seeing a large drop in the number of newly confirmed cases, and we believe that this was possible thanks to the public's efforts in participating in the social distancing campaign for the past 4 weeks. And during the past 4 weeks, we had a very orderly carried out general elections, and the public was proactively at the front lines in practicing the hygiene measures. And we believe that many of the people and public can have pride in having control over the virus. However, even the scale is small, we are still seeing cluster infections, and we also have cases whose sources of infections are not yet identified. And the quarantine authorities, we believe that we could have any risk of a cluster infection, and even just tomorrow it can happen. And this is the mentality that we have in order to battle against our COVID-19. We have a very mixed thoughts about these COVID-19. First, when we look at some of the benefits and strength, as we deal with the COVID-19, we are going near summer, which has a higher temperature of weather. And also we have a large and high level of treatments and diagnostic capability. And also we have widespread public participation as well as know-hows and experience. These are some of the advantages that we have. However, on the other hand, there are also some drawbacks. And even despite our effects, we still have long time to go to have a successful vaccine or therapeutics. We still have an ongoing global pandemic, and nearing the end of this year, we believe that our crowdedness will also will increase, and we will be easing ourselves as time goes by. And we believe that it is important for us to make a prolonged response plan to combat the COVID-19. First of all, the quarantine authorities will intensify our screening measures and controlling measures, and we will also supplement our measures in terms of each of the categories. And we mentioned this in the earlier briefing today, but we will have more support for the development and research, and we will also ease related regulations, and we will also establish infrastructures, including a new research center on infectious diseases. And once again, we would like to highlight that every moment that we have is preparing ourselves for a next possible infectious disease outbreak. Thank you very much.
Right, and that was the afternoon briefing on the COVID-19 situation here in Korea, and I still have Soa in the studio with me for a wrap-up of the key announcements.
All right, Kwon Junuk, the vice head of the KCDC, said, again, we have 9 new cases today, and it looks like more than 80% are still related to cluster infections, in fact, 81%. And we now have a total of 1,101 cases from abroad, while the cluster infections are related to, in many cases, to infections at hospitals. And Kwon Junuk also mentioned that we are in the second day of the eased social distancing measures. However, we will have to prepare for a prolonged response plan, which the government is preparing for right now. And this because this is still an ongoing global pandemic, while we have no vaccines ready as of yet. And also later in the day, it looks like the officials are going to have a meeting on supplies needed at medical sites, such as medical equipment.
All right, Soa, thank you for that wrap-up.
Thank you.
Right, with the global economy abruptly grinding to a halt amid the COVID-19 pandemic, international financial institutions and credit agencies have sharply lowered their growth forecasts for this year and beyond. The International Monetary Fund also released its 2020 outlook earlier this month. And for more on that, we connect live to Andreas Bauer, the Assistant Director of the IMF in Washington, D.C. Hello, Mr. Bauer.
Hello, thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you for being here. So what is the IMF's projections for the global economy, including that of Korea, for this year?
Yes, well, unfortunately, we see that the global economy is facing a very challenging outlook. The COVID pandemic is really inflicting a high human and economic damage on the global economy. With that, we're projecting a global recession. And we expect global GDP to fall by as much as 3% in 2020. This is the most severe downturn that we've seen since the Great Depression. So some 90 years ago, it's a once-in-a-lifetime shock, you can say. And this depression is very synchronized globally. It affects advanced economies especially. We expect advanced economies to see a contraction of real GDP of almost 6%. with Europe even falling more, but also in emerging markets, especially commodity producers. Now, in that context, of course, Korea as an open economy also had its growth downgraded, and we now expect Korea's GDP to fall by 1.2% this year, compared to an earlier forecast of an expansion of 2.2%.
So you believe the Korean economy will shrink by 1.2% this year, which is relatively better than that of its counterparts worldwide. Why does the IMF believe that Korea will fare better than its counterparts?
Yeah, so the impact of the pandemic on Korea is coming really from two channels. One is the domestic channel, which refers to the restriction that Korea has put in place to combat the spread. And the other one is the external channel. It is the slowing of external demand due to the measures that other countries have put in place. Now, on the positive side, I think Korea was in a quite advantageous position because it started this crisis with a very strong and very solid fundamentals. In addition to that, the government has been quite proactive in its response to the virus. And that response has relied much less on mobility restrictions and the shutdown of activity, manufacturing plants, etc., than what we've seen in other countries. It has more relied on testing. It has very aggressively relied on contact tracing, on the use of technology. And that has helped, I think, reduce the domestic impact of the virus considerably, apart from flattening the curve and accelerating the turnaround. In addition to that, the government has also implemented policy measures to support the economy, and that is also. What is providing the big drag is that growth in trading partners is expected to be very weak. We're projecting real GDP growth in Korea's exports market to be negative by 3%. Just to give you a relation here, we did not see this in the global financial crisis or in the Asian crisis, so a much more challenging external outlook. Putting this together, it leads us to a smaller contraction than in other countries, but still we find a contraction for this year.
You mentioned government policies. What does the IMF think about Korea's latest fiscal stimulus measures to cushion the country's economy in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And what other relief measures would you recommend?
So, as I mentioned, I think Korea was lucky to enter the crisis from a strong position. I think the fiscal measures taken have been very welcome to soften the blow, to help support activity against this very adverse outlook. The measures have, I think, appropriately focused on two things so far. One is to provide the resources for the medical fight against the virus. And on the other hand, also to support both vulnerable businesses and vulnerable households in this very sudden shock. The approach has been generally targeted, which is what we like to see, which we welcome. Now, looking ahead, of course, we do know that the recovery will be protracted, and therefore we think there is both space, but also a need to continue to provide support. And we therefore hope that policymakers will continue to use fiscal policy in a forward-leaning manner. At this point, the medical part and the resources have been put in place, so I think the focus can now still be on supporting households and especially small and medium enterprises to manage this shock, this big kind of cash flow impact, suddenly revenues falling, salaries declining in some cases, maybe employment getting lost, helping to bridge them over to better times. And on the other hand, also now we can start thinking about the more broader stimulus maybe. And here we can see a role for public investment as well as a more targeted role to strengthen the safety net in a few places. This, I think, are areas where we could see more support.
Mr. Bao, one final question. What is the IMF's forecast for global economic growth for the year 2021?
Yeah, so we think that in our baseline, that the pandemic effect will gradually start to fade in the second half of the year especially. And therefore, our forecast for the next year is a rebound in growth, the projection is for global growth to grow by 5.8%. That is not making up everything that we have lost compared to where the trajectory was before, but it is still a good rebound. For Korea itself, our baseline has a growth rate of 3.4% positive for next year. Now, this being said, uncertainty is extremely high at the moment. We have done some scenarios where the recovery is much slower, or where we have a resurgence of the virus in some countries. And therefore, I think we need to be cautious here. And this is a call for policymakers as well. They have to be prepared to sustain support until really the global economy is back on a much more solid footing.
All right, Mr. Bao, thank you for sharing your thoughts and for being with us at this such late hour in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
비상금융 조치를 대폭 확대해 100조 원 규모의 기업 구호 긴급자금 투입을 결정합니다.
Now, as we mentioned earlier during our Skype interview, the global economy is facing an unprecedented crisis in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Accordingly, President Moon Jae-in has taken a resolute stance, vowing to steer the country into the lead of economic recovery. Within his plan are efforts to stabilize the economy and help small-sized businesses, which is also being supported by members of the public. For more on that, I have Lee Won-jae, founder and CEO of Lab 2050. Welcome, Mr. Lee.
Hello.
And I have Bruce Han, Managing Director at Q Investment Partners. Welcome again.
Thank you very much.
Right, let's begin with you, Mr. Lee. Let's begin with the repercussions of COVID-19 on the Korean economy then.
So employment had the worst hit since the global financial crisis in 2008. So mostly service sector, including retailers and restaurants. And since those services hired a lot of women and the youth, so women and youth are worst hit, and the number of employed people are 195,000 persons less than a year before. So it's a big hit for Korea.
Right, the figures are quite grim then. Mr. Han, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the financial market?
Yes. Well, thank you for having me back. When I first was here 1 month ago on the 19th, the Kospi had closed at 1,439. Yesterday, it closed at 1,893. That is a 32% increase in 1 month since I've been last here. And if you recall, I said, this crisis is not a financial crisis. Yes, it leads to economic downturn, but it is not leading to event risk like in 97 or 2008. This is a confidence crisis. And obviously, we're coming out of that. I think the government has done an outstanding job in controlling the fear, in controlling the panic, especially like last month, the $80 billion emergency budget, which went to support the capital markets, both stocks and bonds. And I think the other measures that they're pushing through now. So I think definitely, myself, I think everyone here, we definitely see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Staying with that optimism, Mr. Han, reports from the IMF and Moody's show that Korea is going to fare much better than its counterparts. Do you share this sentiment?
Yes. Obviously, Mr. Bauer did an outstanding job describing the situation. But just as a recap, the IMF came out and said last week, South Korea will be minus 1.2% growth this year. Now, that's a grim number. That's not so good. But interestingly, that's the best number out of all the OECD countries. As a point of comparison, the US, they're expecting minus 5.9%. Now, why are we optimistic right now? Because the government, again, aggressive fiscal and monetary policy, and corporations, they were able to prevent large-scale production declines in manufacturing and service industries. And yesterday, more good news. I think Hyundai Motors is starting to operate some of their factories again in Europe. So obviously we have to wait until the US and Europe start coming out of this. But I think South Korea is well positioned right now. So next year, the OECD, as Mr. Bauer said, South Korea is expected to grow 3.4%. And fortunately, the US will also grow 4.7%.
Mr. Lee, do you share Mr. Han's optimism?
So it is true that the government has been managing the situation pretty well compared to other peer countries. But still, minus 1.2% is a big hit for Korea because Korea never had a minus economic growth rate in last 2 decades. So this will be very bad for people in Korea for next quarter and second half. And still, so far we had hit in service sector, but now export is getting hit because the developed countries are getting hit and they are not buying our goods because Korea is an export country. So the worst scenario will be happening in the second quarter and third quarter actually, so we need to be prepared.
And keeping that in mind, what are some of the policy tools that the government has adopted to ease the economic fallout amid COVID-19?
So far, the government is planning to provide liquidity worth about 150 trillion won to the market and the households. And those are 3 ways. One is the government had first and second supplementary budget. It's worth 18 trillion won, and it's going to be given to households as emergency relief grants and also funds for small and medium businesses. And secondly, BOK, Bank of Korea, announced liquidity provision of almost about, they said unlimited, but it's going to be about 100 trillion won, and it's going to be given to businesses. And thirdly, the government is also planning to announce this week another policy to help businesses to retain employment. So those 3 ways are ongoing.
Mr. Han, what are your thoughts about the emergency relief funds allocated by the government for the public?
Right. As you all know, there's a standoff right now between the ruling party, the Democratic Party of Korea, which won a majority in last week's general elections, and the Ministry of Finance. So what the Ministry of Finance is asking for is that the bottom 70% of wage earners receive 1 million won, or $820. And last week they proposed a secondary supplementary budget of US $6.2 billion. So $6.2 billion plus another 1 billion US, total of $8 billion. They want to use that to help the 14.8 million households in the bottom 70%. But the ruling Democratic Party, they're feeling emboldened now because of their win. They want to push for everyone receiving this type of fund. That was part of their pledge when they were running for office, as you know. And so in order to do this, they need to raise another 4 trillion won, another $3 billion by issuing bonds. And the Ministry of Finance is saying, wait a minute now, we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We have to think about what will happen in the future if we start printing more money. So that's where the standoff is now. So in order to sort of ease tensions, President Moon yesterday asked for bipartisan support within the parliamentary meeting yesterday. And hopefully we can come to some resolution soon.
Mr. Han, are similar financial measures being adopted by other countries?
Yes, there are. As you know, the US government started giving out $1,200 to adults and $500 to dependent children. Now, there was a criteria for that. Individual adults, you have to make less than $75,000 a year. Married couples, $150,000. Now, there's another part of the government that's pushing for a more aggressive act. They want to give $2,000 a month to Americans 16 years or older who make less than $130,000 a year. And for married couples making $260,000 a year, and they want to cancel rent and mortgage payments for a year. Now, this is very radical. And in Denmark, as you know, the Danish government wants to help companies, their employees. So they're willing to take 75% of the cost in order not to fire the employees. Now, that represents about 13% of the national Danish economy. That's the equivalent to $2.5 trillion stimulus package in the United States over a 13-week period. The UK government actually is doing one step further. I think this is a better job. They're doing the same thing as what the Danish government is doing, helping the corporations, corporate workers, but they're also helping out the independent contractors as well. As you know, only a certain percentage work for corporations in any country, and so compensating only company employees, it leaves out too many outside of the compensation plan, so I think that's a good thing. And Italy, as you know, they're going through a lot of hard times right now. They're suspended debt payments, mortgage payments for the time being.
I see.
Yeah.
Mr. Lee, there are rumors that a third supplementary budget may be proposed by the government, which would make it the first time in almost 5 decades, in more than 5 decades that is. If that does happen, how large do you expect the budget to be and where would it be allocated?
So it's not just a rumor, it's going to be happening, I think, because just I got the number of export for April. So far, for 20 days, it's 25% less than last year. So it's a big hit. And that impact will be given to big conglomerates in Korea from next quarter, and we'll need more money. So, it's very hard to read policymakers' mind, but still we have a lot of rooms. Bruce just mentioned the U.S. Stimulus package, and equivalent number for Korea is 190 trillion won, but Korea still has just 18 trillion won as a supplementary budget, so we have a lot of rooms. So maybe tens trillion won will be ready.
I see. Mr. Lee, the number of workers on temporary leave hit an all-time high last month in March, that is, highlighting the country's labor market crisis as well. President Moon has stressed that reviving the economy will start with job opportunities and end with job opportunities. To this end, what do you expect to see from next week's 5th Emergency Economic Council meeting?
So it is a good point. Temporary leave will be unemployed from next quarter and from third quarter. So I think the focus of the government measure will be on retaining employment. So it's going to be more grant or loans for big businesses to retain their employees. And it's going to be given, I think, efforts to big hit industries, including airline industries.
Mr. Han, as part of efforts to come up with new growth engines, the President has talked about plans to foster new industries that focus on non-face-to-face interactions. What are your thoughts on this initiative?
Yes. Surprisingly, this crisis has allowed this sector, I think, to possibly be fostered and nurtured and developed. So before the outbreak of the virus, as you know, Korea's IT infrastructure, IT development was quite advanced. But interestingly, a lot of Koreans, they don't like to do teleconferencing. I don't know why. I think it's a cultural thing. They're just very shy. Although in America and in Europe, they've been doing it for a very long time. So with this virus, with the social distancing policy in place, I think this is a great opportunity for this sector to be developed. And more importantly, I think hopefully this will also lead to the development of the online education business as well. As you know, we're having a lot of difficulties, challenges right now with kids doing online education. So right now, sort of simplistic, I think with the development, we can get better formatting, better contents, better programming. And at the same time, it'll be a good opportunity for the hiring of more IT staff and more computer specialists in this sector.
Right, we can keep our fingers crossed then for that.
Yes, definitely.
Now, before we continue, let's take a look at this next video that shows some scenes, some of the efforts, that is, being made by members of the public to share the burden of the economic fallout from COVID-19.
Instead of lunch crowds, there are only workers who are busy packaging boxed lunches. It also makes you think that the restaurant must be famous for boxed lunches.
저희가 코로나 때문에 어렵다고 하니까 KT에서 이렇게 도시락을 납품할 수 있게 해주셨어요. 저희 매출의 거의 전부일 정도로 굉장히 큰 도움을 받았죠.
With small restaurants in the Gwanghwamun area seeing their revenues tumble by 70%, one company came up with an idea to save them from going under.
코로나19로 광화문 인근 지역에 있는 식당가들이 많은 어려움을 겪고 있다는 거 알았습니다. 근데 실질적으로 도움을 줄 수 있는 방안이 뭘까 고민하다가 도시락을 만들어서 구내식당에서 우리 직원들이 함께하면 우리 직원들도 참여하게 되고 또 인근 식당들도 좀 도움을 줄 수 있고 그래서 시작하게 되었습니다.
This lunchbox is sold to workers for 4,500 Korean won or $3.7 US, identical to prices charged per meal at the office cafeteria. The price differential with meals served at the restaurants are provided by the company. The initiative has provided much-needed relief for many struggling small business owners.
도시락 프로젝트를 듣고서 다른 회사에서도 같은 일로 참여하는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 중소상공인들이 코로나19로 인해서 되게 어려운데 인근에 있는 식당들뿐만 아니라 같은 어려움을 겪고 있는 다른 쪽으로도 저희 KT는 같이 고민하고 있고 지속 확대해 나갈 예정이 있습니다.
The restaurant is packed with customers who have come here for lunch.
얼마예요, 사장님?
16,000원이니까.
16,000원?
네네.
오늘
네.
저희 이거 결제하고
네.
선결제 5만 원 더 해주세요.
However, customers are paying more for their meals than the usual price.
네네.
This is part of a campaign that began in Yangcheon-gu district to help small business owners overcome their financial challenges. People voluntarily pay more for their meals and named 2 participants to do the same after uploading their receipts on social media. And the selected participants must complete the challenge within 48 hours.
코로나19 때문에 많은 사람들이 밖으로 나오지 않고 또 모임도 줄고 이러다 보니까 아무래도 외식업에 종사하시는 식당을 경영하시는 자영업자들 많은 분들이 굉장히 힘들어하고 계세요. 그래서 이분들을 좀 도울 수 있는 게 뭘까 이렇게 생각하다가 우리 주민들이 또 스스로 참여해서 그들이 가는 단골 식당이나 또 단골 집들 이런 데도 소개도 하고 또 그런 곳에 가서 좀 미리 좀 결제도 해두고 해서 좀 소비를 촉진시키자라는 데로 의견이 모아졌습니다.
우장 16,000원인데 10% 할인해서 14,400원 결제드리겠습니다.
Customers get meals on discount, and restaurant owners enjoy a boost in sales. A win-win situation for everyone.
구청에서 홍보하는 대로 저희 입장에서는 가게 소상공인들 입장에서는 선 결제라도 미리 해주시면은 임대료나 직원 급여나 해서 좀 쓸 여유가 있으니까 캠페인을 많이 좀 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
Acts of charity and compassion are slowly bringing the economy out of a deep freeze.
Well, as we can see in the video, Mr. Han, it's very clear that joint efforts are necessary to overcome this global challenge. What is your assessment of efforts between the public and private sectors?
I think it's just fantastic. Korean people have demonstrated extraordinary strength and the spirit of cooperation in times of difficulty. And I think that's a cultural trait, actually. And I think to be more modern, though, I think we learned a lot from 1997. People still stop me and say, wow, that's fantastic. How could Korean citizens line up and donate gold to give to the government, right? So to use a Hollywood cowboy term, Koreans are excellent at circling the wagons. And that's what we're doing right now. So we're following the dictates of the government, social distancing. And I think what's really quite moving was the fact when I saw last month how doctors and nurses were working around the clock to work with the patients. They weren't sleeping. Restaurant owners were giving food to the doctors and nurses. And then the doctors and nurses from here were going into Daegu, which is where the cluster was. And one thing that I'd like to point out is the Good Landlord initiative here in Korea. I think that's very unique to South Korea. I've seen one-off cases in other countries. I read about them, but that was just like a one-off. In Korea, again, I just think it's unique because we just come together in times of distress, and this is voluntary. And so I think right now, while we see the light at the end of the tunnel, while everyone's just working towards a good common goal, I think right now it's important to sort of put greed and ambition on hold for the time being. And for the landlords, the kind landlords, I think it's a good business policy also. If you're used to getting 100, it's better getting 30, 40 now than 0, right? And I think that means a lot. I think that says a lot, I think.
Yeah, it does. We read about that too.
Yes.
Mr. Lee, with the COVID-19 pandemic expected to be a prolonged fight, what are some of the measures needed to stabilize the economy in the long run, do you think?
I think we need a very bold initiatives. Many world-renowned intellectuals say that the world as we know will not come back. Yuval Harari said that, and Stiglitz said that, everyone. So some people say it's before Corona to after disaster, like BC to AD. And when jobs are lost and when businesses got bankruptcies and developed economies are hurt, I think we need to consider bold initiatives like universal basic income, unconditional cash transfer for everybody so that people can live without jobs and people can transfer one job to another very freely so that we can get into automation and technology very freely and we will still be living, even normal people can be living in that kind of world.
Right, that is a good point. All right, Mr. Lee and Mr. Han, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Right, and that brings us to the end of this edition of COVID-19. We'll be back tomorrow at this hour for a look across the border into North Korea and its efforts against COVID-19 amid the global pandemic. In the meantime, arirangtv welcomes your thoughts and inquiries on our social media accounts or our homepage, arirang.com. Thank you for watching.